Hey there, I've been meaning to make and post this video for a while now. A person who's following my channel and asking my advice as he makes his first kilt had run up against some lack of clarity in the kilt making book that he's following. So we're going to amplify on that. The first thing, in this episode, we're talking about sewing the fell, which is the sewn section of the pleats. In this episode, I'm not going to talk about how to determine the width of the pleat. That'll be a separate episode. I will, however, mention my measuring system is different, and I believe it's superior to the other system. The other system, they measure to the natural waist, but then they add material above that, a couple of inches, 2.5 inches or so, and they call that the rise. I don't understand it. I never learned how to use it. I can't be bothered to learn because I think my system works better, and so do the myriads of contented customers who've put on a kilt that I've tailored for them and gone, whoa, that's comfortable, that fits. QED, quod erat demonstratum, the thing shows itself, proves itself. My system, I measure to the natural waist and the hip and the length, but then to find the line for the strap and the buckle, I drop 2.5 inches in an adult male. There is some refinement to that measurement, which I will cover in a separate episode after I explain it to myself. I've been doing it intuitively for about 40 years now. In any case, so I don't start, when I start sewing the pleats, I don't start by sewing the apron. I start by sewing the first pleat to the second pleat. And that first pleat is where we have the buttonhole. I will, in the later part of this video, I will show how to sew what we call the fell stitch. I believe in the book it's called something else, but the fell stitch. I start at that first pleat rather than shaping the apron because although this isn't higher level maths, this isn't physics, we do have to be careful. We do it because if we are out a single yarn, which is 1 millimeter, which is 32nd of an inch, over the run of the kilt, that can accumulate, and at the end of it, your measurements are right out the window. So by leaving the apron to the last, as careful as you can be, and if you look at it, you can see if it's good enough. If your eye will let it go, it's good enough. Accepted, I should say, is good enough. Then we can shape the apron after that. It eliminates the headache. The one other thing that I do when sewing the pleats, or when I'm measuring the pleats, and I'm just going to get this piece out of the way for a minute, is I have another little hack. Let me just unroll this piece of black watch tartan. Now, the total length, the fell is at or about 1/3 of the total length. So this is 21 inches. The fell is 7 inches. If when we're measuring somebody, the realities of the person's figure may change that. But if somebody sends me their measurements and the length of the fell that they measure, the distance between natural waist and natural hip, if it's a substantial departure from 1/3, I'm going to query. I'm going to ask them again, measure that again, please. Maybe send me a photograph. So when we're measuring and we're laying out for the pleats, let's say that, here's another little thing too, because there's little hacks, there's little things that we can do to make things a little bit easier for us. So if my fell is 7.5 inches, and I'm not sure if you can see it in this light, it's just short. There's the transition between green and black and green. If my difference between my measured fell and an element of the tartan is less than 1/2 inch, let's say, or 3/8 of an inch, I'm just going to move it that little extra bit because it's going to make it easier to consistently sew at the right line. Fewer chalk marks on the cloth. Now, we're measuring, we have a separate measurement. The pleat is the different width at the hip and at the waist. But rather than repeatedly use the tape, because I never completely trust this metal bit at the end. It's not a precision fit, so that could be out as much as a 1/16, or better, half, 1/16 or close to 1/8 of an inch. So if I'm being precise, I measure between two pieces on the tape. But I also have another hack. As you can see here, I've taken some wood, some cedar shim stock, and I've cut gauges templates in various widths, and I've cut them in 1/8 increments. Basically, I've accrued them slowly. You know, as I need a new increment, I'll go out and find that piece of cardstock and cut a new one. But I sew to within 1/16 of an inch, and I do that by two things: the sharpness of the chalk. So this one's actually 5/8, but I make a chalk mark, and I see how that actually translates on the chalk mark. In this case, I've actually got 5/8 is 10/16. With that width of chalk, I've got 11/16. So I can measure when I'm folding, this one, when I'm folding and sewing the pleats, I know that chalk width is about a 32nd. So I can either match the chalk widths, cover one chalk width, or roll inside. And that gives me actually an admirable level of accuracy, from an 1/8 down to a 64th, really. So, and these are all 2.5 inches long. So when working from the raw edge, the top of the kilt, I know with each of them, that is my strap and buckle line, because when we're sewing the pleat, and it's coming to there, and I'm going to grossly exaggerate this right now. This part, on a man, this part is a taper to this here. I'm going to grossly overdraw it right here. This is a taper, and then from this part, it's straight. When we are measuring and tailoring for a woman, the female figure, the taper is uniform, and I'm just going to use a straight edge here. I don't generally have to, I find that I don't have to chalk the whole line when I'm sewing, and I'll show why in a minute. So the female is a uniform taper from the hip to the waist. The man is a taper to the strap line, and then parallel henceforth. So when I'm actually sewing, good job, this is a waste piece of cloth. I can get all of these chalk marks out just with a little bit of press of an iron. There's my, so I measure, I chalk mark that 2.5 inches. I chalk again at the bottom of the fill. Now when I'm sewing this up, I'm just going to get this out of the way, so it would be really funny if I accidentally sewed the two together. Funny in a head slapping kind of way. These things are getting all mixed up. Good job, this is just a demonstration. When I'm sewing this, I'm just going to grab a couple of pins. Now I'm a lefty, so if you're a righty, I'm not deliberately dissing you guys, even though most lefties are, maybe less so in this age, but when I was a kid, I used to get this strap for being left-handed. So, you know, welcome to our world a little bit. I think in many cases, lefties, one of the reasons, or a help perhaps, to our creativity, is that we have to stop and figure things out in our right-handed world. So what I've done is I first pinned it at the strap line, and then I made sure that this was parallel up to the top of the garment. Next I pin at the bottom of the fell. And here I can be a little bit generous, because later on when I'm sewing the steeking, the reinforcing, and then when I press it, this measurement's going to shrink a little bit. So I can allow a little bit of ease there, just a tiny bit, because that's going to be made up later when we press the kilt. Now, having done those two, I just stretch the cloth, and that gives me the straight line. And I'll put another one or two pins in there. Now, if you're a lefty, or if you're sewing on a table, there's this great thing which my late mother-in-law gave me, which is a quilting pad. It's plastic, and it's rather high friction, so the cloth doesn't slip around on it. It doesn't slip around on the table. And it allows you to sew without your needle picking at the surface of the table. So if you're using a shared surface like a kitchen table, they will thank you for that. What I do, because I I need a little bit of slip and slide as I'm manipulating the cloth. I use a piece of plastic hobbyists cardstock that you get in any hobby store. People use this for modeling and stuff because it has very low friction. The cloth can move it back and forth as I'm sewing. Now, as to the seam itself, now I'm going to use white thread to show you just for contrast, and I'm going to make the stitches rather large and sloppy so that, again, they're big enough for you to see. Because ideally, when we sew, I'm just going to back up here, you can see how I do a thumb knot. I don't draw it tight. Then I do a second thumb knot, and then I draw them both tight, and that gives me a large enough knot. And pardon me for a second, I'm reaching past you. And then with my scissors, I give it about 1/8 of an inch. I'm just going to lay that there for now. And then here's the bottom of the fell. Here's the bottom of the kilt. I pass in, and I do a back stitch. And this should be long enough that the knot is far enough up that we're not going to risk seeing it after the seam is done. So I do a back stitch. Can you see that? Like so. Right? And then with that back stitch, my plastic's underneath, good. I'm sewing across, and now we get to see the possibly slightly embarrassing spectacle of me threading a needle in real time. Yeah, the edge is a bit frayed because this is a piece of basting cloth that I'm using. Now, and it's a very tiny needle, so there's just a chance I'm going to have to whip off my glasses and use the old man's zoom. Yep, I'm going to have to do it. This is dignified. But hey, there we go. Bingo. So, I did the back stitch. I do one stitch and then a second stitch. Now again, I'm doing this very large stitches. Ideally, you want to be doing 8 to 10 stitches an inch, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So from the front of the cloth, as you can see, the needle enters the cloth at a, not that time, but at a 45-degree angle down. So on the front, the stitches are going straight across. And on the back, I'm going to do some larger ones, but on the back they're at an angle. I'll do some horrendously large ones. And see if that makes it any more visible. You get the idea. These ones are at an angle. These ones are straight. Now the complication that comes here is, unless you're doing very tiny stitches, and possibly even then, the fact that your needle is going this way against this as relative to both pieces of cloth is it tends to tug this folded piece in that direction. And that's the complication that my long distance student came into, was that the lines weren't lining up, because frankly, if you're off even a single yarn, it's visible from the other side of the room, and it's a fail. You have to do it again. The trick is, now I believe right-handed people, I believe they did this just with a scrap piece of cloth. They would fold it under the leg, maybe cross the leg, and then by manipulating and stitching tight, you could be holding the whole thing and stitching this direction. My old master never taught me that way, because he was in his 80s in the early 70s when he taught me, and I think he was just too physically stiff to do that, so I never learned that way. So maybe they can manipulate the tension this way, but what I've done here is, you see, as I've pinned it up, it's already offset a little bit. I've introduced a bit of tension so that when I start sewing this, I'm going to be pulling up with my right hand as I'm sewing this way to bring it into its correct tension. It's something you're just going to have to try yourself, and then from practice, sometimes a lot of practice, you will eventually get it though, if you keep at it. It's introducing a little bit of tension there so that as you're sewing, the cloth, which is past, the folded over bit is a little bit high relative to the finished garment. By adding that little bit of tension as you're sewing, but when you get done, it's perfect. And you'll also notice, actually I'll show you right now, when you're sewing this buttonhole, possibly this is a little late to introduce it, but what the heck. When I'm sewing the buttonhole, let's say that the buttonhole, and I determine that width by using the strap. and I just mark both pieces like that, right? As I'm doing this on the piece, got my plastic underneath so I don't wreck this lovely table, I sew down to a spot just short of that chalk mark. I don't want to go right up to that chalk mark, but I'm back about, what, 1/8 of an inch. Have you got a good angle to see that? Back about 1/8 of an inch, and then I back stitch it a couple of times. And again, I'm doing very large stitches here, right? Like that. And then I got to get down here. So I use this side, not this side. I use on the single width of cloth, I do a number of back stitches, and I'm doing them rather large here. And of course, if I was doing this for real, I'd be using correctly colored thread. I back stitch down. So ideally, it's not visible at all on this side. And it looks like that on the back side, till I get a place, an equivalent distance away from the top of the buttonhole down here. And I do 2 or 3 more attack, shall we say. And then I resume my stitching to the top of the garment. When I get to the top of the garment, and I'm not going to sew it all in real time, let's just get down here. When I sew here at the top, remember this edge is a raw edge, it's fray, and we don't want it to fray. I'll pass it 2 or 3 times, and then I'll capture the threads on the end by passing. You can see what I did there. I passed over the edge like a blanket stitch, because unless you've got, even if you're working with a very vest cloth, devilish, you're going to lose a couple of yarns. If you're using, see, now this stuff is wonderfully woven, so it's not coming loose, but something that's the slightest bit looser woven than this, you're going to be shedding yarns like no get out, or any, like, I forget the original phrase, like all get out. I think that's it. So I do a capture rather than have these things shedding, right? And then having captured it, I'll do a knot, and I just go 1, 2, 3, I might go up to 5. Then having done the knot, and here's a great thing, I may not have shown you this elsewhere. Let's say I want to control where this knot winds up. I put my needle through the eye of the knot, and then as I'm drawing the knot tight, I drag it down with the needle to where I want it, and then pull it tight. And then I pass that through, or I would have, but the thread just slipped off the needle. And then on we go. Now, I believe I've answered all my questions. I'm actually going to consult my lesson plan here for a change. Often I just bash on regardless, but I wanted to make sure that I got all of this in one for this presentation. A, because it's way overdue. B, my cameraman, thank you very much, has got things to do himself. So there we are, the salient points of offsetting the cloth. So we're using tension as we're sewing it, the correct fell seam, not as clumsy as that, of course, and the use of my little guides, little bits of wood. And it could even be cardboard cut out of a cereal packet, right? It just won't last as long. In graduated widths of 1/8 of an inch that you can adjust in increments by the sharpness of the chalk, also the angle that you hold the chalk at and such. So there we are. I'll post it. Doubtless there'll be questions, comments, and concerns, and we'll address them as they happen. So thank you very much, and keep sewing, and also, hey, keep safe.